Selfishness isn't always about oneself, sometimes it's about a world that demands too much. Welcome to Egopedia.
Selfishness is not always about oneself, but about the world that is too burdensome. A psychological and social reflection on the hidden causes of withdrawn behavior. Selfishness is commonly framed as a moral failure, a conscious preference for one's own needs at the expense of others. Yet, beneath its surface lies a more complex psychological reality. This article challenges the oversimplified view of selfishness by exploring how it often emerges not from narcissism or entitlement, but from exhaustion, overstimulation, emotional burnout, and the psychological pressure to constantly give. We argue that in many cases, selfishness is not an act of egocentrism, but a quiet attempt to survive a world that feels unrelenting. Rethinking the concept of selfishness. In most social and moral frameworks, selfishness is viewed as a character flaw, a symptom of greed, entitlement, or emotional immaturity. We are taught from an early age to share, to care for others, and to avoid being selfish at all costs. In religious, educational, and even therapeutic settings, the selfless person is often celebrated, while the selfish one is reprimanded, corrected, or shamed. But what if this black and white perspective oversimplifies the truth? What if selfishness isn't always about taking more than one needs, but instead about reaching a limit, mentally, emotionally, or spiritually? In recent years, thinkers in psychology, trauma research, and behavioral science have begun to challenge the rigid moral framing of selfishness. They argue that many behaviors labeled as selfish may actually be acts of protection, self-regulation, or recovery. In this sense, selfishness becomes not a moral failure, but a response to overwhelm, a signal that the person has run out of capacity to give, respond, or engage. The problem with labeling without context. When we label someone as selfish, we usually do so without understanding the context of their behavior. Are they truly ignoring others for personal gain? Or are they withdrawing because they are depleted, overstimulated, or quietly unraveling inside? In the absence of context, we confuse self-preservation with self-importance and emotional limits with emotional coldness. This misjudgment has real consequences. It reinforces guilt in people who are simply trying to heal. It prevents healthy boundary setting. It can even drive emotionally exhausted individuals further into isolation or shame. A society that punishes boundaries. We live in a culture that frequently romanticizes sacrifice and punishes healthy selfishness. People are praised for working overtime, putting others first, and being constantly available. Meanwhile, those who dare to say no, take time off, or step back from draining relationships are often seen as uncaring or lazy. In such a culture, the threshold for being labeled selfish is low. All it takes is choosing solitude over socializing, putting mental health before obligations, saying, "I can't take this on right now." These behaviors are often misinterpreted, but in many cases, they are the first brave steps toward personal stability, toward a compassionate redefinition. This article seeks to redefine selfishness not as a failure of empathy, but as a natural psychological boundary that arises when a person has reached their energetic or emotional limit. By understanding selfishness through this lens, we can cultivate more compassion for ourselves and others, encourage deeper listening and context before judgment, or learn to differentiate harmful self-absorption from necessary self-focus. This rethinking doesn't excuse behaviors that harm others. Instead, it allows us to respond with curiosity rather than condemnation, asking not just what someone did but why they might have done it. We begin to ask, is this really selfishness? Or is it someone finally protecting the only resource they have left themselves? The psychological burden of living in a demanding world. To understand why some individuals begin to behave in ways that are perceived as selfish, we must first examine the psychological landscape of modern life. Today's world, while more connected than ever, is also overwhelmingly demanding mentally, emotionally, and socially. These demands aren't just occasional. They are constant, often subtle, and widely normalized. The result is a quiet epidemic of people who are internally drowning while externally functioning. a culture of constant availability. We live in an era where availability is expected to be immediate and responsiveness is seen as a measure of care. Work emails, messages, family group chats, social obligations, news updates, and personal goals create a never-ending loop of stimulation. The boundaries between on and off, private and public, have all but dissolved. Many people feel as though they must answer messages right away or risk being seen as distant. Stay productive at all times, even during rest. Support others emotionally even when they are not emotionally stable themselves. This creates a perpetual sense of emotional obligation, in which not only one's time but also one's attention, empathy, and energy are expected to be shared freely, repeatedly, and without rest. Chronic overwhelm and emotional fatigue. When these social, emotional, and digital demands pile up over time, they contribute to chronic overwhelm, a state where the nervous system is constantly on high alert, managing too many inputs without sufficient space to recover. Emotional fatigue may look like feeling exhausted after minor conversations, becoming irritated more quickly than usual, needing excessive alone time just to feel neutral again, struggling to care about things that once mattered. Under these conditions, withdrawing becomes a coping mechanism. It may seem selfish to others, but for the individual, it is an essential act of psychological preservation, the invisible work of empathy and caregiving. It's also important to recognize the invisible labor carried out by many people, especially those in caregiving roles and paths, highly sensitive individuals, and those in people-centered professions, e.g., teachers, therapists, nurses, parents. These individuals often give emotionally without receiving in equal measure. Over time, this imbalance leads to compassion fatigue, emotional numbness, resentment masked by detachment, a sense of identity erosion. At this stage, even basic social requests may be experienced as overwhelming, prompting behaviors like emotional withdrawal, boundary enforcement, or refusal to engage. These responses are often labeled as selfish, when in fact they are red flags of emotional exhaustion. The psychological consequences of constant giving. When someone gives too much without restoring their own energy, they can begin to feel depleted, unable to respond to others because they haven't had time to respond to themselves. Resentful, not out of selfishness, but because their giving has gone unacknowledged or unreciprocated. Invisible, feeling like a function in others' lives rather than a full human being. Depersonalized, as if they are performing their social roles rather than living authentically. At this point, people may start saying no, not replying to messages, or becoming protective of their time and space. This shift, while healthy in many ways, is often met with criticism, especially from those who have benefited from the person's previous overextension. When the world feels like too much, not everyone who acts selfishly is trying to exploit others. Often, they are simply trying to quiet the noise, to stop feeling like they are always on, or to protect the small, fragile part of themselves that is still capable of healing. Their selfishness isn't about wanting more from the world, it's about needing less. They don't reject relationships or responsibilities because they don't care, but because they feel they have nothing left to give without breaking. Trauma and the internalization of overwhelm. To understand why some people appear selfish, we must move beyond surface behavior and examine the inner world shaped by trauma and chronic emotional overload. Trauma, whether acute, developmental, or relational, has the power to reshape a person's nervous system, worldview, and ability to connect with others. And in many cases, what looks like selfishness on the outside is actually a protective mechanism on the inside, shaped by years of psychological strain. Trauma is not just what happens to you, it's what stays inside you. Trauma is often misunderstood as a singular event, such as abuse, violence, or loss. But trauma can also result from subtle, persistent emotional experiences, such as growing up in a household where emotional expression was unsafe, being expected to perform or achieve without rest or recognition, constantly caring for others while one's own needs were ignored, experiencing rejection, criticism, or abandonment from caregivers or peers. These experiences don't just hurt, they shape how a person interprets emotional demands, especially in relationships. Over time, the individual may internalize the belief that, if I don't take care of others, I'll be rejected. No one will take care of me, so I have to protect myself. If I give too much, I'll lose myself. From the outside, this might manifest as withdrawal, boundary enforcement, or emotional distancing. But these behaviors are not rooted in malice, they're learned survival strategies. The nervous system in survival mode. Trauma keeps the nervous system in a heightened state of vigilance, what Dr. Bessel van der Kolk calls a body that keeps the score. This dysregulated state affects how people relate to others. Hypervigilance may lead to avoidance of emotional conversations. Emotional numbing may look like coldness or disinterest. Fight or flight tendencies may cause someone to abruptly end relationships or shut down emotionally. People who live in survival mode often do not have access to their full emotional capacity. They may care deeply, but be unable to show it. They may want to be generous, but lack the bandwidth. Their selfishness is actually a trauma response, an effort to remain emotionally intact in the face of potential overwhelm. Fawn freeze and the illusion of detachment. In trauma psychology, the fight or flight response is well known, but less understood are the fawn and freeze responses. These can also mimic what society mislabels as selfishness. Fawn, people-pleasing to avoid conflict until burnout sets in. Once exhausted, these individuals may suddenly disappear or pull away, seeming selfish, when in fact they're collapsing from emotional fatigue. Freeze, emotional shutdown or disengagement when things feel too overwhelming. These individuals may avoid others not because they don't care, but because interaction feels dangerous or draining. In both cases, behavior is misread as indifference or self-focus, but at its root is a traumatized system attempting to regulate itself. The fear beneath the surface. At the core of many trauma-based behaviors is fear. Fear of being consumed by others' needs. Fear of being emotionally flooded and unable to recover. Fear of being hurt, judged, or abandoned. So when someone says no, avoids a conversation, or sets a firm boundary, it might seem selfish, but they may actually be fighting to preserve the last remnants of their emotional safety. This is not selfishness as arrogance, it is selfishness as armor. Self-focus as a trauma-informed strategy. For trauma survivors, especially those who experienced emotional enmeshment, setting limits and turning inward are not acts of ego, but acts of recalibration. They are trying to rebuild a sense of self that was eroded by years of being overly responsible for others. This healing process often includes limiting how much emotional labor they do for others, reassessing which relationships are safe, prioritizing internal safety over external approval. These steps are necessary, but they are not always understood by others. To outsiders, this can look like withdrawal, rejection, or selfish behavior. In reality, it is a return to emotional integrity. Conclusion of this section. Trauma complicates how people give, love, and engage. It narrows emotional bandwidth and recalibrates survival responses. When we see someone acting selfish, we must consider, are they pushing others away to dominate or to survive? Recognizing the internalized overwhelm that trauma brings allows us to respond not with judgment, but with compassion, patience, and nuance. Because the person who seems the most emotionally closed off may, in fact, be the one who has been hurt the most. Empathy of selfish people. The hidden empathy of selfish people. At first glance, the term selfish seems to describe someone who cares only about themselves, ignoring the needs, feelings, or concerns of others. It implies a lack of empathy, a person who takes without giving, demands without offering, and protects their own interests at the expense of everyone else. But this assumption often overlooks a deeper psychological truth. Many so-called selfish people are not lacking empathy at all. In fact, they may feel too much. Empathy doesn't always look like kindness. We tend to associate empathy with soft, visible gestures, listening patiently, comforting someone, or putting others' needs before our own. However, True empathy is not always expressed in conventional or socially pleasant ways. It can exist even in the absence of communication or support. Some people withdraw not because they don't understand others' feelings, but because they understand them all too well. Their emotional sensitivity is so heightened that they absorb others' pain almost physically. They become overwhelmed by interpersonal tension. They anticipate the emotional needs of others even before they are voiced. This constant, involuntary emotional tuning often leads to exhaustion. Over time, they may develop protective behaviors that look selfish on the surface, such as setting hard boundaries, avoiding emotional conversations, or distancing themselves from people who demand too much. But these behaviors often emerge not from indifference, but from overexposure. Empaths who became selfish to survive. Many selfish behaviors are born in people who were once deeply giving, sensitive, or emotionally available, but who reached a breaking point. These individuals may have grown up as emotional caretakers in dysfunctional families, always put others first in adult relationships, only to feel unappreciated or drained, been the go-to person for emotional support at the expense of their own mental health. Eventually, they come to a crossroads, continue pouring out their emotional energy until they are depleted, or turn inward and protect themselves. This turning inward, this boundary drawing and emotional conservation, is what others sometimes call selfishness. But it is, in truth, a strategy born from emotional burnout. Protective self-focus is not the same as narcissism. It's crucial to differentiate between protective self-focus and pathological self-absorption. The former is rooted in emotional fatigue and survival, the latter in manipulation and disregard. Protective self-focus may involve saying no more often, prioritizing solitude over constant social contact, being selective with emotional labor. These choices may appear selfish to those who expect unlimited access to someone's time and care, but they are actually signs of someone practicing emotional boundaries after a lifetime of overextension. Empathy that informs distance. Interestingly, the empathy of so-called selfish people is often what informs their withdrawal. Because they understand others' emotional needs so clearly, they may preemptively pull back out of fear that they will not be able to meet those needs. Their presence will become a burden. Their lack of energy will disappoint others. This creates a paradox. Their empathy, rather than drawing them into connection, becomes the very thing that drives them into solitude. They don't walk away because they don't care. They walk away because they care too much to stay half-present or give what they cannot authentically offer. The empath who learns to say no. When an empath starts to say no, set limits, or reclaim their time, it often feels to others like a betrayal. Friends, family, or colleagues who are used to their constant availability may interpret this as selfishness. But in reality, it may be the most honest, mature form of empathy they've ever expressed because it honors both their limits and others' needs. It resists the illusion that empathy requires self-sacrifice. It sets the stage for sustainable connection, not performative self-erasure. In this light, selfishness becomes an act of integrity, not rejection. It becomes a signal that the person is finally listening to themselves as much as they've always listened to others. Closing thought for this section. When we look closer, we see that many people labeled selfish are simply empaths in retreat, not because they have no empathy, but because they were never taught how to protect it. Their boundaries are not barriers, but the last effort to keep their empathy alive without being destroyed by it. 5. Cultural expectations and the myth of constant availability. In many societies today, selfishness is often judged through the lens of cultural expectations, standards that are not always fair, healthy, or humane. One of the most powerful and toxic of these expectations is the myth of constant availability, the belief that to be a good friend, partner, parent, or worker, you must always be on, emotionally accessible, and ready to give. This myth is not just unrealistic, it is deeply harmful. It creates a culture where boundaries are seen as betrayal, solitude is seen as rejection, and rest is mistaken for neglect. Under this lens, anyone who dares to prioritize themselves, even temporarily, is labeled selfish, when in fact, they are often doing the hard work of self-preservation and balance. The always-on culture. Modern technology, especially smartphones and social media, has normalized an always-on mentality. People are reachable 24/7, and response times have become a measure of loyalty or care. In professional settings, this manifests as being expected to reply to emails or messages after hours, feeling pressure to say yes to every request to prove dedication, having to stay emotionally engaged in every meeting or interaction, regardless of energy or well-being. In personal relationships, this may look like being guilt for not replying quickly to messages, being expected to emotionally support others, even while overwhelmed, being shamed for wanting space or silence. This cultural norm quietly implies that being perpetually available is virtuous, and that needing space is selfish. Selflessness as a social ideal. In many cultures, especially collectivist ones, there is a strong emphasis on self-sacrifice. A good person is often defined as someone who puts others first, endures discomfort without complaint, gives freely, even when depleted. While these values can foster compassion and cooperation, they can also become weapons of social control. When individuals attempt to set boundaries or reclaim energy, they are often shamed, guilt-tripped, or labeled as cold or uncaring. This makes healthy self-protection look like moral failure. Gendered expectations around availability. Cultural expectations are often disproportionately placed on women, who are frequently expected to be emotional caregivers in their families, peacekeepers in relationships, nurturing and accommodating in the workplace. When a woman sets firm boundaries, prioritizes her own needs, or refuses to perform emotional labor, she is often judged more harshly than her male counterparts. She may be called selfish, difficult, or even unfeminine. Similarly, men face pressure to remain stoic and unemotional, yet are expected to show up and provide without expressing their inner struggles. When they withdraw or emotionally self-regulate, they too may be labeled distant or uncaring. These gendered narratives reinforce the myth that goodness equals emotional servitude, while self-care equals selfishness. The burnout loop. When people internalize these cultural expectations, they often fall into the burnout loop. 1. They try to be constantly available, helpful, emotionally present. 2. They ignore their own limits in order to meet social expectations. 3. They begin to feel exhausted, resentful, or invisible. 4. They finally withdraw in self-protection, prompting others to call them selfish. 5. Out of guilt or social pressure, they re-enter the loop, continuing to erode their well-being. This loop is not only unsustainable, it destroys authenticity. People in this cycle aren't truly giving out of love, they're giving out of fear. Fear of being unloved, rejected, or morally judged. When boundaries are revolutionary. In a culture that idolizes constant giving, saying no becomes a radical act. Setting boundaries, especially emotional ones, is a way of reclaiming agency, preserving inner peace, challenging toxic norms about worth and service. When someone withdraws from a group chat, declines an invitation, refuses to offer emotional support when they are burned out, or simply goes quiet for a while, they are not necessarily being selfish. Often, they are choosing presence over performance, wanting to return to their relationships not as a shell of themselves, but as a full, rested, and honest version. Reframing what it means to be available. True emotional availability is not measured by frequency or speed of response, but by depth, honesty, and sustainability. A person who takes time for themselves, says no when necessary, and responds only when they have the emotional capacity to do so, is not selfish. They are self-aware. In this reframed view, taking time away is preparation, not abandonment. Silence is not always neglect, it can be healing. A well-placed boundary is a gift to both giver and receiver. Conclusion of this section. The myth of constant availability fuels unrealistic social demands and punishes people for taking care of themselves. But cultural evolution begins when individuals refuse to accept burnout as a virtue. Sometimes, The most generous thing a person can do for the world is to step back, rest, and return when they are whole. 6. When self-focus becomes necessary, not optional. In a world that often demands our attention, energy, and emotional labor, self-focus is not a luxury, it is a survival mechanism. While it is easy to label self-focused individuals as self-centered or uncaring, a closer examination reveals that this inward turn is often a response to chronic overwhelm, emotional depletion, or unprocessed trauma. For many, self-focus is not a lifestyle preference, it is an existential necessity. Self-focus as the first step towards psychological survival. There are moments in life when people reach a threshold, their emotional resources run out, their mental health begins to deteriorate, and they recognize that continuing to give without pause will lead to collapse. At this point, self-focus becomes a moral imperative, not an act of defiance. It becomes the decision to take rest before burnout turns into breakdown, process pain before it becomes projection, reconnect with one's inner voice before it is drowned out by others' expectations. In such moments, turning inward is not selfish. It is a lifeline. Self-focus is not the same as selfishness. To understand this, we must differentiate selfishness as entitlement from self-focus as recovery. Entitlement demands from others, while recovery retreats to rebuild. People who become self-focused after years of giving are not suddenly abandoning others. They are attempting to rescue what's left of themselves. This may involve saying no more often, even to people they love, disconnecting from emotionally draining conversations, prioritizing mental health, physical rest, and solitude over social obligations. What the outside world sees as pulling away is often someone pulling themselves back together. The psychology of energy preservation. The human brain is wired for emotional conservation. When people are in distress, their ability to empathize, listen, and regulate emotions narrows. This is not due to a lack of care, it's a neurological reality. Under prolonged stress or trauma, the prefrontal cortex, responsible for empathy and reasoning, goes offline, and survival instincts dominate. This is why someone may seem emotionally unavailable or selfish during crises. They are protecting their last reserves of energy. Just as a starving person cannot feed another, an emotionally drained individual cannot be a consistent source of support and shouldn't be expected to be. The danger of ignoring the need for self-focus. When people deny themselves the right to self-focus, usually due to guilt, social conditioning, or fear of judgment, they often suppress emotions until they erupt in anger or anxiety, stay in toxic dynamics longer than they should, resent the very people they're trying to help, lose clarity about who they are and what they want. Ironically, this produces the very disconnection they hoped to avoid. Without self-focus, their empathy becomes unstable, their care performative, and their boundaries porous. In the long term, ignoring the need for self-focus leads to relational breakdown, emotional numbness, and even identity erosion. Self-focus as the foundation of authentic generosity. Only when individuals feel safe, rested, and self-aware can they offer genuine presence to others. In this way, self-focus is not the opposite of generosity. It is its prerequisite. A person who has taken time to reflect, heal, and reconnect with themselves is better able to show up with consistency, not resentment. Offer empathy from abundance, not obligation. Listen with presence, not performative concern. Their giving is no longer a strategy for approval or avoidance. It becomes a natural overflow of their grounded self. From self-focus to self-alignment. When self-focus becomes necessary, it is also an opportunity, a time to rediscover alignment. This is when individuals ask, what values actually matter to me? What relationships are reciprocal and which are extractive? What kind of emotional life do I want to build? These questions don't signal withdrawal, they mark the beginning of conscious living. Self-focus becomes not just a defense against burnout, but a blueprint for healthier choices, relationships, and environments. There comes a time when turning inward is not a betrayal of others, but an act of devotion to the self, one that makes future connection possible. To pathologize self-focus is to overlook its role in healing, recovery, and rebirth. Sometimes, the most selfless thing a person can do is to become whole alone before they offer themselves again to the world. Toward a more nuanced vocabulary for selfishness. Instead of labeling people as selfish, we should consider a broader emotional vocabulary. Is this person withdrawing or truly being self-absorbed? Are they protecting themselves or harming others for gain? Is their behavior driven by malice or by exhaustion, fear, or need for space? By asking these questions, we begin to see that not all selfishness is the same. There is a profound difference between exploitative selfishness, taking more than one gives, protective selfishness, refusing to give when depleted. Understanding this difference changes not only how we view others, but how we forgive ourselves. Selfishness as an echo of struggle, not just ego. Selfishness is often less about self-importance and more about emotional survival in a world that demands too much. When people withdraw, refuse to engage, or prioritize themselves, they may be doing so not out of callousness, but because they have been pushed beyond their emotional bandwidth. We do not excuse harmful behavior, but we must learn to distinguish selfishness rooted in narcissism from that rooted in emotional exhaustion, boundary setting, or unhealed pain. Because sometimes, what looks like selfishness is just someone finally choosing not to break. End note for reflection, Egopedia style. Before you judge someone for pulling away, ask, what kind of weight were they carrying before they dropped mine?